I like to look at, power relationships and power relations, I guess you could say, and who actually holds power. And most times, those who hold power are those who determine what is actually violent. And when we think about if we look at what's happening in Israel, the so-called state of Israel, because I cannot legitimize the state of Israel or the United States. But when we look at these settler colonial states, when we look at how they have achieved these states, when we look at how they continue to enact violence throughout the world, throughout the world, when they do so, it's never violence. But when those who are engaged in some forms of self-defense, it is considered violence. And so I always want to say, well, self-defense is not violence, but the actions of the colonizer are in fact violent. And when I look at self-defense and I look at, who determines the morality behind self-defense, typically that's those who are in power. And so I think that there has to be a consideration of morality in a lot of how we look at violence and how we look at, what is, what is the actual act of violence? Like, what are the conditions of which violence is achieved, or violence is happening, or violence has occurred, and who holds that power? Now, when we think about interpersonal violence versus state violence, I think that there is a different understanding of violence, because at the end of the day, interpersonal violence, perhaps there is a different relation, like there's different relations of power that exist interpersonally within our communities, amongst ourselves. I think that there's also that, unfortunately, that dynamic between, of patriarchy between men and women, and when we think about violence in relations to that, which I would not say that just because you're a man, and you're automatically, or patriarchy is automatically exists, and therefore you are the only one who is violent, because obviously I think that women can be violent too, to a certain extent. But at what point do we determine whether or not it's self-defense? And so I think that it's always important to think about, when we think about violence in terms of who, like, how, what are the conditions of which the so-called violence has been created. And to me, I think in contemporary society, all violence has been created by the state, in which we would call uh, the colonial power. I think that I think from my understanding of violence, violence is a form of destruction. And so when you want to just when it's not a it's not it doesn't create anything, in my opinion, right? It destroys something. But when I think about self-determination, and I look at the means by which you get to be self-determined, and if you say by all means, by any and all means necessary, you might be destroying something. But I don't think, as people, as colonized people, as people who are determined to live a peaceful life, right? I do not think, in my opinion, I do not think that we are destroying anything outside of destroying the power structure that exists. And when I look at the power structure that exists, I don't consider it legitimate. It's not legit. And so if I was to destroy something that legitimately exists, in this case, those who are indigenous to certain lands, then I would look at that as violent, which that's why I say I look at the colonial constructs, or colonial imposition, as violence, because they are destroying something that is legitimately exists, that naturally exists in its rightful place. And so that to me is violence, by stealing lands, by taking African people and removing them from their own uh, continent, from their own lands, and forcing labor on them. That is violence. Those are acts of violence. Those are acts of destruction. You're destroying people, you're destroying resources, you're destroying the lands. Capitalism and imperialism, those are violent. That's violence. That's what I look at when I think about violence. The destruction of people, the destruction of land, the destruction of societies that have existed already. And then when I look at those who are in defense of their right to exist, their natural human right to exist, and destroying something that is not legitimate in the first place, I don't look at that as a destruction. I look at that as a creation of a new society, a new world of which people can live peacefully. And so by destroying destroying the colonial relationship, by destroying the power of the colonizer, I do not look at that as acts of violence. I look at that as I don't know. I just look at that as the natural right to exist. And I think it's very interesting because a lot of these colonizers all use ideas that they will essentially say the same thing in their own, like, from their their own historical ideology. If you think about the Romans and the Greeks and all of that, and even those so-called founders of the United States, they will look at they will talk about legitimacy, and they will talk about rights and all of this. And even the UN, the fact that the UN has these clauses of human rights and the right for self-defense and the rights for self-determination, as because people have the human right to exist. And I think it's interesting that they're able to create, or they have this language that exists, yet they will only use that to defend themselves and their illegitimate right to exist.